She had read the letters so many times that she no longer needed to hold them to remember them. 6 letters from a man in Oregon. 6 letters written in a careful, slanted hand, the kind of handwriting that belonged to a man who had learned his letters in a one-room schoolhouse and never quite forgotten the effort it took. She could have recited them in her sleep. She very nearly did. His name was George Whitfield. He had 40 acres in the Willamette Valley, a 2-room house he had framed himself, a milk cow named Adelaide, and no wife. He was 34 years old. He had come west from Indiana in 1852, and he had been alone, he wrote, for long enough. Eleanor Marsh was 27 years old, and she had been alone for considerably longer than she looked. She did not know, as she stepped onto the ferry crossing the Missouri River at Independence on the 12th of April, 1857, that George Whitfield had been dead for 11 weeks. She did not know that a letter had been sent from a man named Foss, a neighbor who farmed the land just east of George's claim, addressed to Eleanor Marsh, Cincinnati, Ohio. She did not know that the letter had arrived 3 days after she left. What she knew was this: she had sold her sewing machine, her mother's clock, and every piece of furniture that was hers to sell. She had said goodbye to her mother on a Tuesday morning so cold that her breath had made small clouds in the March air. And she had not let herself cry until the Cincinnati ferry landing was out of sight behind her. She had $22.60, a trunk full of practical things, a Bible, and 6 letters from a man she had never met. She was going to marry him at the end of 2,000 miles, and she was not afraid. Or rather, she was afraid of exactly one thing, and it was not the trail. She was afraid that she would arrive and he would look at her and realize the letters had promised more than she could deliver. She was a plain woman who worked with her hands and spoke plainly and had lived her whole life in rooms that belonged to other people. She had told him this, or something near it, in her second letter. He had written back that he did not need poetry. He needed someone steady. She had read that sentence 17 times. She could be steady. Whatever else she was or was not, she knew how to be steady. The wagon train that took Eleanor west out of Independence on that April morning was made up of 21 wagons, 43 adults, and 14 children. The wagon master was a man named Kurt Hadley, broad-shouldered, sparse with words, with eyes that were always scanning the distance as if reading weather nobody else could see. His wife Nell walked beside their wagon for most of each day and spoke enough for both of them combined. Nell Hadley was 41 years old and had already made this crossing once, in 1849, and she had the manner of a woman who had decided, after surviving something very large, that small things no longer frightened her. Eleanor had been assigned to walk beside the Hadley wagon on account of traveling alone. Kurt had said this without ceremony. "You'll ride or walk with us." It was not an invitation so much as an instruction, and Eleanor accepted it the way she accepted most instructions, quietly, without making it mean more or less than it was. The trail in April was still winter-colored in places. The grass along the Platte River Valley was thin and pale, not yet the deep green it would become by June, and the mornings were cold enough that Eleanor's fingers ached around the handle of the water bucket. She had not expected that, the cold. She had pictured the trail as something that happened in heat and dust, but in those first weeks, the cold settled into her knuckles every morning and did not fully leave until afternoon. She walked an average of 14 miles each day. She counted them. She counted them because George was at the end of them, and counting felt like doing something. At the end of 4 days, she had walked 56 miles. At the end of 2 weeks, she had covered 183 miles, and her boots had begun to chafe at the left heel, and she had learned that the sound of the wagon wheels changed on wet ground, a lower, pulling sound, like the earth not wanting to let go. She kept a small journal, not the elaborate diary that some women on the train kept, with pressed flowers and lengthy passages, but a plain notebook in which she recorded the distance, the weather, and one observation each day. On April 28th she wrote, "Saw 3 antelope on the ridge to the north." On May 3rd she wrote, "Nell Hadley gave me dried apple. I had forgotten how sweet a thing can taste after days of salt pork." On May 7th she wrote, I think I am beginning to understand what George meant when he said he wanted someone steady. This land will break a person who cannot be still inside themselves. She did not know yet that she was writing to a dead man. They reached Chimney Rock on the 23rd of May, at mile 604 of the trail. Eleanor had been told to expect it, and still it stopped her where she stood. The column of rock rose 325 feet out of the flat Nebraska plain, as if someone had left something there and forgotten to come back for it. The other women on the train exclaimed when they saw it. Eleanor did not make a sound. She stood and looked at it for a long time, and then she walked on. That evening, around the fire, Nell Hadley asked her what she had thought of it. Eleanor considered the question. It looked permanent, she said. Nell studied her. You've been looking for permanent a long time, Nell said. It was not a question. Eleanor did not answer. But she thought about those words for 3 more days. They crossed the North Platte on June 1st at a ford that had been used by enough wagons before them that the river bottom was rutted with wheel tracks even under 4 feet of moving water. The temperature of the river was cold enough to make Eleanor's legs go numb to the knee. The crossing took 2 hours and 40 minutes. One wagon from the Reed family lost a wheel coming up the far bank, and the whole train stopped while the men worked to fix it. Eleanor sat on a rock with her feet bare and her stockings spread on a bush to dry, and she wrote in her journal, "I understand now why women write so much on this trail. There is nothing else to do with what you feel." It was at Fort Laramie, on June 14th, at approximately mile 640 of the trail, that the rider came. He was coming east, a mail rider, bringing letters from ahead down to the train still moving up behind. He stopped at Kurt Hadley's wagon first, and Kurt sorted through the folded papers and called the names he found written on them. Eleanor's name was among them, but the handwriting was not George's. She knew George's handwriting the way she knew her own face. The hand on this letter was rougher, the letters pressed harder into the paper as if the writer had been angry or in a hurry or both. The return marking was from a man named H. Foss, Willamette Valley, Oregon Territory. She stood with it in her hands for a long moment. Around her the camp was moving in its familiar afternoon rhythms, supper being made, children being called in, the oxen standing loose-hipped in the shade of the cottonwoods. Nell was watching her from the corner of one eye. Eleanor walked away from the camp. Not far, only to the edge of the cottonwood trees where the fort's wall cast a long shadow in the late afternoon light. She stood in that shadow, and she opened the letter. She read it 3 times. George Whitfield had died on the 3rd of February of this year. A fever. It had come on fast and not relented. He had been ill for 12 days. Mr. Foss had been with him at the end and had written to Eleanor because he had found her name and address in George's papers, along with the correspondence they had exchanged. He was sorry, Mr. Foss wrote. George Whitfield had been a good man. The land claim was in order. And then, Eleanor read this sentence twice and then a 3rd time. George had added her name to the claim papers some months prior, anticipating the marriage. She was listed as Eleanor Marsh Whitfield. She was still Eleanor Marsh. No one could say with certainty what that meant in law. But Mr. Foss had thought she ought to know. She stood in the shadow of Fort Laramie's wall for a very long time. The letter did not shake in her hands because her hands did not shake. She had been steady for 27 years, and she was not going to stop now. But something moved through her. Something that was not quite grief because she had never met him, and not quite relief because she was not that kind of woman, and not quite fear, though it was nearest to fear. It was something without a clean name. It was the feeling of a door closing in a house you had never entered but had been walking toward for a very long time. When she came back to camp, Nell Hadley looked at her face and did not ask a single question. She handed Eleanor a tin cup of coffee and moved over to make room by the fire. That was all. And it was enough. For 3 days after Fort Laramie, Eleanor spoke very little and worked twice as hard. She found that moving helped. She walked further ahead of the wagon than usual, out to the edge of where the trail was still clearly marked, and she looked at the distance and she let herself feel the full weight of what she was carrying. Not just George's death, but the strangeness of grieving a man who had been a collection of sentences on paper. She had loved, she thought, what he had offered more than who he was. A home, a name on a piece of land, a future that was hers. Those things were still there. George was not. The difference between the two felt, in those first days, like the most important thing she had ever had to understand. On the 4th day after Fort Laramie, she made her decision. She told Nell that evening, plainly, without drama. She was going to Oregon. She was going to file the land claim. She was going to stand on the 40 acres that now had her name attached to them, however complicated the attachment was, and she was going to figure out the rest from there. Nell said, "I figured you'd say something like that," and went back to stirring the pot. It was around this time that Eleanor began to notice Thomas Aldridge. She had noticed him before, the way you notice all the people in a small traveling group after enough days. But she had not thought about him particularly. He was a widower, traveling with 2 sons. James, who was 14 and had his father's square jaw and his mother's temper, and Caleb, who was 9 and had a habit of collecting interesting rocks and offering them to anyone who stood still long enough to look. Thomas himself was 36, from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, with large steady hands and a way of moving through the camp that was calm and economical. No extra motion, no performance. He was not a man who talked much. Eleanor respected that. What she had not noticed, until Nell pointed it out with the bluntness that had become Eleanor's favorite thing about her, was that Thomas Aldridge had been quietly and consistently making himself useful around the Hadley wagon for the past 3 weeks. "He fixed your wheel last Tuesday," Nell said. "Kurt fixed my wheel. Kurt helped. Thomas found the crack." Eleanor considered this. "He asked me," Nell continued, without looking up from her mending, "about a week after Fort Laramie, whether you were managing all right. He knew about the letter." "How?" Nell shrugged. "People see things." Eleanor folded this information away and did not take it out again for some time. But she did not forget it. They reached South Pass on the 4th of July, mile 947, the Continental Divide, 7,412 feet above sea level. The pass itself was gentler than Eleanor had imagined. A long gradual rise that made you feel for a while as if you were climbing without quite climbing, and then quite suddenly the land tilted west and you understood that the direction of water had changed beneath your feet. Everything from here flowed toward the Pacific. Eleanor wrote in her journal that evening, "We are past the middle now. Everything runs downhill from here. I do not know if I am still the same woman who left Cincinnati in March, or if she was left somewhere back along the Platte. Perhaps it does not matter. The one who is here will do." There was a small celebration that evening for the holiday. A little music, a little whiskey passed among the men, the children running in the late dusk. Caleb Aldridge appeared at Eleanor's side with a piece of granite he had found near the pass and placed it in her hand without ceremony. "It's got a vein of quartz through it," he said, pointing. "Nell said you like interesting things." "Did she?" Eleanor said. The boy nodded seriously and went back to his father's fire. She kept the rock. She didn't quite know why. The days after South Pass were harder in a way that was different from the earlier hardship. The trail through present-day Idaho ran along the Snake River Plain, a landscape so raw and volcanic that it felt, Eleanor wrote, like the earth had not finished deciding what it was going to be. The ground was black with old lava in places, and the heat came up from it differently than heat came up from any earth she had known before. The alkali flats were the worst of it, a white crust over the ground that powdered under the wagon wheels and burned the nostrils and killed 3 of the Morrow family's oxen in a single night. The animals died fast, lying down in the traces between 1 hour and the next, and the sound of the Morrow children crying in the morning carried across the whole camp before anyone had eaten breakfast. Eleanor had helped the Morrow family redistribute their load. She had done it without being asked and without commentary. James Aldridge had watched her from across the way with an expression she could not read. Not quite hostility, but something guarded, something that was measuring. She did not try to make him like her. She understood that his weariness was not about her. The Snake River had to be crossed at 3 Island Crossing on August 2nd, 3 braided channels cutting across basalt shelves in the afternoon heat. 2 wagons went across without incident. On the third crossing, a family's oxen panicked mid-channel and the wagon went sideways in the current. Thomas Aldridge was on horseback at the crossing's edge. He moved before anyone else did. Not fast in the way of a young man showing off, but fast in the way of a person who had already calculated what needed to happen and was simply doing it. He pulled the woman from the water 30 yards downstream and got her to the bank. That evening he sat by his own fire and made no mention of it. Caleb had fallen asleep against his father's arm. Eleanor watched for a moment, then went back to her wagon and opened her journal. She wrote, "There are men on this trail who speak constantly of what the West will give them, and then there are the ones who are already giving something and saying nothing about it. I have been thinking about which kind of man George Whitefield was. I find I don't know. I have only letters. Thomas Aldridge has no letters. But I have watched him at the river today, and I think I understand something now about the difference between knowing someone on paper and knowing someone on the ground." She did not write his name again for 3 weeks. The Blue Mountains of Oregon arrived in mid-August, and they were not gentle. The trail climbed sharply through stands of pine and fir that smelled, finally, like something green and wet after months of sage and dust. Eleanor breathed it in like a person who had been underwater. The wagons strained up grades that left the oxen blowing hard and the men pushing at the wheels from behind. Eleanor walked every step of it. She would not ride when the animals were struggling. Her boots wore through on the left side near the ball of the foot, and one evening she found a piece of cut harness leather left at the back of her wagon with no note attached to it. She patched the boot that night and did not say anything about it the following morning. But she thought, "I am not accustomed to this. A thing done quietly, with nothing asked in return." She did not know yet whether to trust it or simply to receive it. They came down out of the mountains on August 24th, and for the first time Eleanor could smell the Willamette Valley before she could see it. It was a green smell, deep and wet and unlike anything the trail had offered in months. The women around her wept. Eleanor did not weep, but she stopped walking for a moment and stood very still and let herself breathe it in, all of it, every molecule of it, and she felt something ease in her chest that had been tight since March. They reached the Dalles on September 1st and took the Barlow Road the final 40 miles. 3 more days. On the 4th of September, 1857, Eleanor Marsh walked into Oregon City. She found the land office on a Thursday morning in a building that smelled of fresh lumber and pipe tobacco. The clerk was a tired-looking man with ink-stained fingers who read her papers with the expression of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything that came through his door. She explained the situation plainly. George Whitefield, deceased. Her name on the claim papers. She had traveled from Ohio. She was here. On September 7th, the land claim was hers. 40 acres in the Willamette Valley. A 2-room house framed by a man she had never met. A milk cow named Adelaide who regarded Eleanor with the mild suspicion of a creature that had outlived one owner and was reserving judgment on the next. Eleanor stood in the house on September 8th, a Tuesday, the light coming through the single west-facing window in the late afternoon, the color of something old and very quiet, and she let herself be still. The house smelled of pine sap and old ash from the hearth. It was cold at the edges and the floor needed work, and there was a crack along the north wall that would want sealing before winter. It was hers. She put her hands flat on the wall, and she stood there for a moment with her eyes closed, and she felt the wood under her palms, rough and real and present. She wrote in her journal that evening, "I do not know what to call this feeling. I have arrived. The man I was coming to is gone, and I am sorry for that, though I find I cannot be sorry in the way I would be sorry for losing someone I knew. What I feel is something quieter. I stood in this field today and put my hands in the earth and it was still warm from the summer, and I thought, this is the first thing that has ever been mine. Whatever comes next, this is where I begin." Thomas Aldridge arrived in the valley 3 weeks later. On a morning in late September when the first chill of autumn had moved into the air, the grass going gold, the sky a hard clear blue. He had filed a claim of his own, 120 acres to the north, not far. He came to tell her this in the direct and unceremonious way he did everything. James was with him, guarded as ever. Caleb was with him, carrying a new rock. Eleanor made coffee. They sat on the broad step of the two-room house. There was no porch yet, just the step, and they drank it and looked at the valley opening up below them in the morning light. Thomas said the boys were settling. He said the claim looked promising. He said he had heard she'd gotten the land business sorted. Not without trouble, Eleanor said. But it's sorted. He nodded. He looked at the field. Adelaide giving you milk? Every morning. Caleb presented her with the new rock. Dark basalt, an orange vein running through the center, and she turned it over in her hands. I'm not going to make you any promises, Thomas Aldridge said, after a time, looking at the horizon rather than at her. I don't think either of us has much use for promises. Eleanor considered this. She looked at her field. She looked at the boy asleep against the doorframe with the rock he had already forgotten about still in his hand. I have use for neighbors, she said. He looked at her then, directly, finally. There was something in his expression she could not name with any single word. Not hope, exactly. Something more careful than hope. Something that had been tested and knew what testing cost and was still, quietly, present. Then that's what I'll be, he said. They sat there a while longer in the autumn morning. The valley held the light the way a valley does. Slowly, evenly, without preference for any one thing within it. Eleanor drank her coffee and did not say anything further. There was nothing further that needed saying. She had come 2,000 miles to a man who was gone, and she had arrived anyway. She had walked out into her field and put her hands in the ground, and it had been warm. Whatever this was, this quiet morning, this careful man beside her, this valley gold and green and entirely indifferent to everything she had survived to stand in it, it had not been promised in any of the 6 letters, but it was here, and so was she. She would write about it only once, in the last entry she ever made about the trail. A single sentence, on a page she left otherwise blank. I did not know, when I memorized his handwriting, that the life I was walking toward was not the one he described. She closed the journal. Outside, the valley held the morning like it had been holding it for 1,000 years, waiting for someone steady enough to come and stand in it.